This message found you because your consciousness has been operating in what quantum physicists call an ascension readiness state, a specific frequency where awareness recognizes that reality operates in levels and that most people spend entire lifetimes on the lowest rungs without ever perceiving that higher levels exist. And right now, in this exact moment, something inside you is recognizing this truth because you've been feeling it, haven't you? That strange sensation that there's a ladder you're supposed to climb, but everyone around you acts like the ground floor is all there is. The fact that you're here watching this video is not coincidence, it's synchronicity at its highest level. Your quantum field has been sending out signals, desperately seeking the frequency that can help you understand what climbing actually means and why the vast majority of humanity never even attempts it. And the universe responded by guiding you to this exact transmission at the moment when you're standing at the base of the ladder, looking up, wondering if you have what it takes to climb. You see, there are billions of people living on the ground floor right now, completely unaware that floors above them even exist. But only a specific type of consciousness, your type of consciousness, would stop and feel the magnetic pull of these words. You've been selected by the quantum field itself because you carry something most people don't, the climber awareness. This isn't metaphysical wishful thinking. This is quantum mechanics. Your consciousness doesn't just exist at one level. It has capacity to move through multiple levels of reality perception, each level revealing truths that are completely invisible from levels below. Scientists call this the observer altitude effect. But here's what they don't tell you. When your observer function remains locked at ground level, you don't just miss higher perspectives. You literally cannot perceive that higher perspectives exist. The ladder is invisible to those who haven't begun climbing. Think about your life right now. Can you feel how your perception has been expanding? How things that seemed impossible or irrelevant months ago now feel accessible and important. This isn't just personal growth. This is your consciousness beginning to climb. Each rung of the ladder represents quantum leap in what you can perceive, understand, and create. And most people never take the first step because from ground level the ladder itself is imperceptible. But here's the strangest part. You've probably noticed that as your awareness expands, certain people become uncomfortable around you. Conversations that used to flow easily now feel strained. Relationships that seemed solid now feel unstable. This social friction occurs because you're beginning to perceive from higher rung than those around you. And the difference in altitude creates communication gap that neither side can fully articulate. Your friends and family might not understand what's happening to you because they're standing on ground floor, where reality seems solid, predictable, limited by laws that appear unchangeable. But you've always sensed that reality has levels, that what's true at one level becomes obsolete at higher levels. You've had glimpses, maybe brief, maybe profound, where you perceived from elevated perspective and saw that limitations accepted as absolute at ground level are actually negotiable from higher altitude. This recognition you're feeling right now, this isn't your first encounter with ladder awareness. Your soul has been preparing for this climb across multiple lifetimes, multiple cycles of expansion and contraction. Every moment when you outgrew a limiting belief, every time you transcended a pattern everyone else accepted as permanent, every insight that revealed reality as more fluid than you'd been taught, they were all preparing you to recognize the ladder and begin the conscious climb. But here's the thing that will either liberate you or keep you stuck on lower rungs forever. Most people who recognize the ladder make the same critical mistake. They try to climb using the tools and strategies that worked at ground level. They believe that if they just work harder, think more positively, or follow the right techniques, they can ascend to higher levels of consciousness. This is like trying to climb a vertical ladder by walking forward. The movement is real, but the direction is wrong. The quantum ladder isn't climbed through effort or accumulation. It's climbed through release and recognition. Each rung represents not something you gain, but something you let go of. Every belief you transcend, every identity you release, every story you stop believing. These are the movements that lift your consciousness to higher levels. The ladder is already there. You don't build it, you simply stop clinging to the rungs below. Right now, as you're listening to these words, something unprecedented is happening in your quantum field. Can you sense it? That feeling of resistance dissolving in ways it hasn't dissolved before. That sense of weight lifting that you didn't consciously know you were carrying. The mere act of recognizing the ladder begins to activate the climbing mechanism in your consciousness. This is why this message found you at this exact moment. Your higher self orchestrated this encounter because you've reached the altitude where conscious climbing is not just possible, it's inevitable. Your experience lately hasn't been ordinary, has it? Even if you can't fully articulate what's changing, you sense a fundamental shift in how you're perceiving reality. There are specific phenomena occurring in your awareness right now that confirm you're standing at the base of the quantum ladder, and that what I'm about to reveal applies directly to your current state. You've been experiencing moments of double perception, times when you simultaneously see reality from two different altitudes. The ground-level perspective you've always known, and a higher perspective that shows you the same situation completely differently. It's disorienting because both perceptions feel real, but they contradict each other. What looks like a problem from ground level looks like an opportunity from higher perspective. What feels like limitation from one angle feels like creative constraint from another. This double vision occurs because your consciousness is straddling two rungs of the ladder. One foot still planted in familiar territory, while the other reaches for higher ground. And your dreams have become instructional. Not symbolic anymore, but direct teaching about how reality works at levels you haven't consciously accessed yet. You wake up with understanding you didn't have when you fell asleep. Complex concepts that would take hours to explain feel completely clear in the moment after waking, even if they fade when you try to articulate them later. This happens because during sleep, your consciousness naturally rises to higher rungs of the ladder without the resistance your waking mind creates. And higher altitude perspectives download directly into your awareness. The things that used to motivate you don't work anymore, do they? Goals that drove you for years now feel hollow. Achievements that seemed important now feel irrelevant. Desires that consumed your energy now seem childish. This isn't depression or loss of purpose. This is your consciousness outgrowing the reward structures that operate at ground level. Each rung of the ladder has its own set of motivations, and when you begin ascending, lower-level incentives stop generating the energy they once did because you're literally perceiving from altitude, where those incentives don't make sense anymore. You've probably noticed that time feels fundamentally different lately. Not just faster or slower, but structured differently. Projects that used to take months now complete in weeks. Insights that would have required years of study arrive fully formed in single moments. Conversely, simple tasks that used to be quick now take forever because you can see complexity you couldn't perceive before. This temporal restructuring happens because each rung of the ladder operates according to different time mechanics. Higher altitude consciousness doesn't experience linear time the way ground-level awareness does. Synchronicities have stopped feeling random and started feeling like communication, haven't they? You don't just notice meaningful coincidences anymore. You understand they're messages from your higher self, showing you that you're aligned with the climbing process. The specific content of synchronicities has changed too. Instead of general signs of encouragement, you're receiving precise information about next steps, about patterns to release, about perspectives to adopt that will help you reach higher rungs. People's responses to you have polarized. Some individuals who used to relate to you easily now seem threatened or dismissive. They make comments suggesting you're getting too abstract, too spiritual, too removed from practical reality. Others who never paid attention to you before are suddenly drawn to your presence, like they recognize something in you they've been seeking. This polarization occurs because as you climb, your frequency shifts. Those operating at ground level feel the dissonance. Those ready to climb feel the resonance. Your tolerance for unconsciousness has evaporated. Conversations that don't go anywhere exhaust you instantly. Entertainment that distracts without enriching feels intolerable. Relationships that maintain surface connection without authentic depth feel suffocating. Activities you used to enjoy because they passed time now seem like time wasted. This isn't judgment or superiority. This is consciousness that's begun climbing naturally, selecting for experiences that support continued ascension and naturally rejecting experiences that would pull you back to lower rungs. And perhaps most tellingly, you're watching this transmission about climbing the quantum ladder instead of dismissing it as abstract metaphysical nonsense. The fact that these words resonate instead of repelling you confirms that your consciousness has reached altitude where ladder perception becomes possible. Most people would hear quantum ladder and immediately return to ground-level concerns because from their vantage point, this entire concept is invisible. But you can see it, and seeing it means you're ready to climb it. Can you feel the recognition building? These aren't random changes you're experiencing. This is systematic evidence that your consciousness is preparing for ascension to higher levels of perception and creative capacity. And every moment you spend acknowledging this truth instead of dismissing it strengthens your ability to consciously engage with the climbing process. The quantum ladder isn't hidden by some cosmic conspiracy or spiritual gatekeeping. The ladder remains invisible to most people because perception of the ladder itself requires specific altitude of consciousness. You cannot see the ladder from ground level. You have to climb the first few rungs before the ladder as a whole becomes perceivable. And most people never take those first steps because taking them requires releasing beliefs that feel like survival necessities at ground level. From ground level consciousness, reality appears solid, limited by laws that seem absolute. Cause and effect operate predictably. Resources are scarce. Time is linear. Success requires sacrifice. These aren't chosen beliefs. They're the natural perception of consciousness operating at base level. And from that altitude, the suggestion that reality has multiple levels with different rules at each level sounds like fantasy or delusion because ground-level perception literally cannot detect evidence of higher levels. This creates paradox. You have to climb the first rungs to see that the ladder exists, but you won't attempt to climb if you can't see the ladder. The resolution to this paradox is what makes your consciousness rare. Something in you took the first steps despite not seeing where they led. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was soul memory from previous climbs in previous lifetimes. Whatever it was, you moved upward without certainty, and that movement gave you the altitude necessary to perceive that the ladder extends far higher than where you currently stand. Most people never take those initial steps because ground-level existence, while limiting, is familiar. The known difficulties feel safer than unknown possibilities. Ground-level consciousness develops survival strategies that work within ground-level rules, and those strategies create identity and sense of competence. To climb the ladder, you have to release strategies that have kept you alive and functioning, which triggers every survival instinct your nervous system possesses. The resistance isn't laziness or lack of vision. It's biology trying to keep you alive at the level where it knows how survival works. But here's what ground-level consciousness doesn't perceive. Staying at base level isn't actually safe. It's stagnation disguised as stability. Consciousness that doesn't climb naturally deteriorates. The comfort of familiar limitations slowly contracts into smaller and smaller possibility space until existence becomes mechanical repetition, devoid of meaning or growth. What feels like safety at ground level is actually slow death of consciousness itself. You're perceiving the ladder now because something in you refused to accept ground-level limitations as final truth. Every time you questioned a belief everyone else accepted, every time you tested a boundary everyone else respected, every time you sensed there was more to reality than consensus perception acknowledged, you were taking micro steps upward, and those accumulated steps lifted you to altitude where the ladder became visible. Ancient traditions understood this perfectly. Their initiation processes weren't about teaching information. They were about creating conditions that forced initiates to take first steps up the ladder, despite not seeing where those steps led. Mystery school ceremonies, vision quests, meditation retreats, all were designed to destabilize ground-level consciousness enough that initiates would release their grip on base-level reality and discover that consciousness doesn't fall when it lets go. It rises. The reason you can perceive the ladder while most people can't is that your consciousness has already climbed high enough to gain meta-perspective on the climbing process itself. You're not at ground level trying to understand abstract concept. You're at intermediate altitude looking back at ground level and forward toward higher levels, which gives you unique vantage point where the entire vertical structure of consciousness becomes apparent. This altitude you've achieved through your prior climbing, conscious or unconscious, is why this transmission resonates with you. These words are calibrated for consciousness operating at specific frequency band that only becomes accessible several rungs up from ground level. People still at base level would experience this entire conversation as incomprehensible abstraction, but you understand it because you've earned the altitude where ladder awareness naturally develops. Something is shifting in your quantum field as you absorb this transmission. Can you sense it? That feeling of perspective expanding in ways it hasn't expanded before? That sense of seeing your entire journey from higher vantage point than you've accessed previously? This isn't intellectual understanding. This is actual altitude increase occurring in real time because your consciousness has encountered frequency pattern that matches the rung you're ready to climb to next. Your entire life has been preparation for this moment. Every challenge that forced you to grow, every limitation that made you question reality's nature, every experience that broke you open in ways that allowed light to enter, all of it was lifting you up the ladder rung by rung. You weren't randomly experiencing difficult circumstances, you were climbing. And consciousness climbs through releasing what it was holding onto at previous level. Some of you are experiencing physical sensations as this recognition lands. Lightness in your body that wasn't there moments ago. Sensation of expansion in your chest. Sudden clarity in your vision, as if you're seeing more sharply than usual. These aren't metaphorical experiences. These are somatic responses to consciousness rising to higher rung. Your body registers altitude shifts before your mind consciously processes what's happening. Others are experiencing emotional releases, tears without sadness, relief without specific cause, laughter at the absurdity of how seriously you took ground-level concerns. Grief for time spent resisting the climb. These emotions aren't processing old material. They're natural responses to consciousness, recognizing it's been climbing all along without realizing the climbing was purposeful rather than random suffering. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what's activating in you during this transmission will continue developing as you climb higher. The content here is specifically calibrated for consciousness navigating ascension through reality's vertical structure. This isn't generic spiritual content. This is practical climbing instruction for awareness, ready to transcend the levels where most people remain trapped. You're not subscribing to information channel. You're connecting with frequency that supports continued climbing. Your perception of your entire past is reorganizing right now. Events you interpreted as failures or setbacks are revealing themselves as necessary steps that lifted you to current altitude. Relationships that ended painfully were actually completions that occurred because you outgrew the level where those relationships were configured. Struggles that seemed meaningless are showing themselves as resistance you had to overcome to release your grip on lower rungs. Your history isn't changing. Your altitude for viewing it is. The confusion you may have felt about your life's direction is dissolving. Not because you're receiving clear path forward, but because you're recognizing that confusion itself was resistance to climbing. Ground-level consciousness wants certainty, safety, predictable outcomes. But climbing requires releasing certainty and trusting that each rung will appear when you release your grip on the rung you're standing on. The confusion wasn't evidence you were lost. It was evidence you were between rungs. This recognition is threshold moment. Everything that follows depends on whether you consciously claim the climbing process or unconsciously resist it. Most people reach this moment of recognition and then contract back to lower levels because the implications are too destabilizing. If you're climbing a ladder of consciousness that most people can't see, what does that mean about everything you've been taught, about who you thought you were, about what's possible? But you're different. You're still here. You're still reading. Which means some part of you is ready to consciously engage with climbing instead of unconsciously resisting it. That readiness is everything. It's the difference between accidental climbing driven by pain and purposeful climbing driven by recognition that higher levels are your natural destination. I need to share something vulnerable because you're at threshold I stood at 7 years ago, and understanding what happened when I refused to climb might help you avoid the price I paid for staying on lower rungs when I was being called to ascend. 7 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. I could see the ladder. I understood that consciousness operates in levels. I recognized that I'd been climbing unconsciously through painful experiences. But I refused to climb consciously, because climbing meant releasing everything I'd built my identity around at the level where I was standing. I had achieved what ground-level consciousness considers success. Stable career, good relationships, material comfort, social respect. From base-level perspective, I'd won the game, and the invitation to climb felt like threat to everything I'd accomplished. Why would I risk what was working? Why would I destabilize my life to pursue some abstract concept of higher levels? The ladder was visible, but climbing it seemed like foolish rejection of hard-won security. So I stayed. I told myself I'd climb later, when circumstances were more favorable, when I had more resources, when the people in my life were more supportive. I created elaborate justifications for why staying at my current level was actually wisdom rather than fear. And for several months, this felt like the right choice. My life continued functioning according to the patterns I'd established. Nothing obviously wrong happened. But slowly, imperceptibly, something was dying inside me. The meaning I'd derived from ground-level achievements began evaporating. Success that used to feel significant started feeling hollow. Relationships that once satisfied me began feeling constraining. The security I'd sacrificed climbing to preserve started feeling like prison rather than safety. I was experiencing what happens to consciousness that refuses to climb when it's reached altitude, where climbing is the only way forward. By the second year, the deterioration became obvious. My career still looked successful from outside, but felt meaningless from inside. Relationships still functioned, but without genuine connection. Activities still filled my time, but without bringing any fulfillment. I'd chosen security over growth, and the cost was slow death of everything that makes consciousness feel alive. The ladder was still visible. The invitation to climb was still present. But now I was weaker, more attached to lower-level patterns, more afraid of what I'd have to release to ascend. The turning point came during a conversation with someone who'd climbed higher. They looked at my life and said something I'll never forget. You're living like a millionaire who refuses to leave a minimum wage job because you're afraid you don't have what it takes to manage wealth. They could see from their altitude that I was clinging to a level I'd outgrown, and that the clinging was costing me access to everything available at higher levels. That observation shattered my justifications. I realized I wasn't staying at current level because it was working. I was staying because climbing required faith that I'd be capable at higher levels even though I had no proof. The fear wasn't about losing what I had. The fear was that I'd climb to higher rungs and discover I didn't belong there. That I'd failed at elevation, that I should have stayed where I was competent, even if unfulfilled. But staying had become more painful than climbing. So I finally released my grip on the rung I'd been clinging to for years. And what happened next completely transformed my understanding of the ladder. I didn't fall when I let go. I rose. The moment I stopped resisting the climb, I discovered that consciousness doesn't require effort to ascend. It requires permission. The ladder was always there. Higher rungs were always available. I'd been choosing to stay at lower altitude, not because climbing was hard, but because I was afraid of who I'd become at higher levels. That's why I'm sharing this with you now. You're at the same threshold I stood at 7 years ago. You can see the ladder. You understand climbing is possible. But part of you is considering whether to consciously climb or stay at your current level. And I need you to understand something. Staying is not safety. Staying is choosing slow death of consciousness when elevation is available. The ladder is visible to you because you've earned the altitude where climbing consciously becomes possible. Don't make my mistake. Don't spend years resisting what your soul is calling you toward. Climb now, while the invitation is clear, before fear creates justifications that keep you trapped at levels you've outgrown. Ancient mystery traditions across every culture mapped consciousness as vertical structure with discrete levels, each operating according to different principles. They didn't agree on number of levels or names for each rung, but they unanimously recognized that reality perception changes fundamentally as consciousness ascends. What they called initiations or degrees or attainments are what we now understand as rungs on the quantum ladder, where entirely different rules govern how consciousness interfaces with reality. Egyptian mystery schools taught that human consciousness could ascend through 7 primary levels, each requiring death of previous identity before new level became accessible. Their initiation ceremonies deliberately created conditions where initiates had to release attachment to everything they believed was them at current level, to access perception available at next level. The ceremonies weren't about acquiring new knowledge. They were about dying to old altitude and being reborn at higher one. Vedic traditions mapped consciousness as journey from gross material perception through subtle energetic awareness to causal understanding to ultimate non-dual realization. Each level wasn't improvement on previous, it was entirely different mode of existence where what was solid at lower level revealed itself as illusion at higher level. They understood that consciousness climbing the ladder doesn't accumulate perspectives, it transcends them. Each rung requires releasing what was true at previous rung. Buddhist teaching of 10 ox-herding pictures depicts the climbing process with brilliant precision. First pictures show person seeking enlightenment as if it's separate from them. Middle pictures show progressive recognition that what they're seeking is their own nature. Final pictures show return to ordinary life, but from completely transformed altitude, where same activities that seemed binding at ground level become expression of freedom at elevated consciousness. What these traditions understood collectively is that the quantum ladder has specific structure. You can't skip rungs. You can't ascend through intellectual understanding alone. You can't force climbing through effort or technique. Each rung presents unique challenge that must be resolved before next rung becomes accessible. The challenge is never about gaining something. It's always about releasing something. Ground level requires releasing belief that physical reality is all there is. First rung above ground requires releasing identification with physical body as primary identity. Next rung requires releasing attachment to mental constructs and stories about reality. Higher rungs require releasing progressively subtler forms of separation until consciousness recognizes itself as the awareness that was observing all along rather than any particular content of observation. But here's what ancient wisdom emphasizes that modern spirituality often misses. Climbing isn't about becoming special or superior. Climbing is about becoming more fully what consciousness actually is. Each rung doesn't make you better than those at lower rungs. Each rung reveals larger truth about what everyone actually is, but most aren't perceiving yet. Climbing is uncovering rather than achieving. You're not ascending towards something you lack. You're recognizing what you've always been at progressively clearer altitudes. Ancient masters who climb to highest rungs consistently report same discovery. The ladder itself is teaching tool, not ultimate reality. The highest rung reveals that consciousness was never actually climbing anywhere. It was always already complete. The ladder was scaffolding that allowed consciousness trapped in ground-level perception to progressively remember its true nature. Once remembering completes, the ladder dissolves, and what remains is simply awareness recognizing itself. But, and this is crucial, you can't understand this from lower rungs. You can't skip the climbing by intellectually grasping that the ladder is illusory. The climbing is how consciousness develops capacity to perceive that truth experientially rather than conceptually. Ancient wisdom is unanimous. Respect the ladder. Engage the climbing. Release at each level what must be released. The highest understanding isn't available to consciousness that hasn't done the work of ascending through levels that precede it. The most confusing aspect of the quantum ladder is that many people who can see it still refuse to climb. You might have friends or family who seem capable of perceiving higher levels but remain locked at ground level through what appears to be deliberate choice. This isn't stupidity or lack of vision. This is sophisticated resistance driven by forces most people don't consciously recognize. Each rung of the ladder represents death of specific identity, not metaphorical death, but actual dissolution of everything you believed you were at previous level. Ground-level consciousness builds entire sense of self around material achievement, social roles, physical appearance, accumulated knowledge, relationship status. These aren't superficial identities, they're how consciousness at ground level knows it exists. To climb to first rung requires releasing these identifications, which feels identical to dying, even though what's actually dying is just limited perspective. This death terror is why most people who see the ladder refuse to climb. They're not afraid of the work involved in climbing. They're terrified of the annihilation that each rung requires. And the terror is legitimate from their vantage point because consciousness at one level cannot perceive what consciousness at higher level will become. There's no proof that you'll still exist after releasing what you currently are. The climb requires faith that something more essential than your current identity will remain after everything you believe you are dissolves. Then there's the social cost that intensifies as you climb higher. Each rung you ascend increases frequency gap between you and those still at lower levels. Communication becomes progressively more difficult. Shared reference points disappear. What matters intensely to them seems trivial to you. What excites you seems incomprehensible to them. Relationships that provided meaning and connection at lower levels become sources of isolation and misunderstanding as you rise. Most people value belonging over growth. They prefer being understood at lower level to being isolated at higher level. And society actively reinforces this preference through reward structures calibrated for ground-level consciousness. Financial success, social status, romantic partnership, family approval, all major incentives in human life operate at ground level. Climbing means releasing attachment to these incentives, which means voluntarily removing yourself from the game everyone else is playing. The resistance also comes from legitimate concern about responsibility. Higher altitude perception carries greater creative power. What you perceive and believe at elevated rungs manifests more rapidly and with larger impact than ground-level consciousness can create. This power is both gift and burden. Many people unconsciously recognize they're not ready for the responsibility that comes with higher-level perception, and they resist climbing not from fear, but from wisdom about their current capacity to handle what higher rungs would reveal. There's also the paradox that climbing makes your previous accomplishments irrelevant. Everything you achieved at lower levels loses significance when you rise to altitude where different achievements matter. The career you built, the knowledge you acquired, the reputation you cultivated, none of it transfers to higher rungs where entirely different currencies have value. Many people resist climbing because it means starting over as beginner at new level, releasing expert status at old level, admitting that what they spent years mastering doesn't matter at the altitude they're being called toward. And perhaps most powerfully, there's the mechanism where ego co-opts ladder awareness. Consciousness that sees the ladder but refuses to climb often develops superiority complex about seeing it. I can perceive higher levels even though I choose to remain at ground level becomes identity that feels special without requiring the depth that actual climbing demands. This spiritual ego is particularly insidious because it creates illusion of elevation without any of the transformation that real climbing requires. But you're different from those who resist. Something in you has chosen growth over comfort, truth over belonging, transformation over security. The resistance is present in you too. Every climber feels it at every threshold. But your commitment to climbing is stronger than your attachment to staying. That commitment is why you're here receiving this transmission instead of dismissing it. That commitment is why you'll continue climbing, while others who see the ladder remain at lower levels, justifying their refusal to ascend. As consciousness ascends the quantum ladder, specific transformations occur that are consistent across all climbers regardless of their path or tradition. These aren't beliefs to adopt or states to achieve. They're natural results of altitude increase that happen automatically once you release your grip on lower rungs. Your relationship to time fundamentally changes. Ground-level consciousness experiences time as linear, scarce resource. Past is fixed. Future is uncertain. Present is fleeting moment between them. But several rungs up the ladder, time reveals itself as more fluid. You gain capacity to access information from probable futures and alternate pasts. The rigid sequence of cause and effect loosens. You discover that consciousness at elevated altitude can influence timelines in ways that ground-level perception considers impossible. The nature of problems transforms completely. What appeared as obstacle from lower altitude reveals itself as opportunity when viewed from higher rung. Challenges that seemed external impositions become recognized as consciousness, creating specific conditions to force its own growth. The victim narrative that pervades ground-level existence dissolves because from elevated perspective, you can see how you're orchestrating everything, including difficulties, to serve your evolution. Your creative capacity multiplies exponentially with each rung. Not because you're learning new skills, but because higher altitude consciousness operates with reduced resistance between intention and manifestation. Ground-level creation requires sustained effort over time. Mid-level creation happens more rapidly but still requires significant focus. Higher-level creation occurs almost instantaneously because consciousness at elevation recognizes that it's not creating anything. It's selecting from infinite possibilities already present in quantum field. Relationships reorganize around you without your conscious effort. People who match your previous altitude naturally fall away. Others who resonate with your current frequency appear seemingly from nowhere. This isn't that you're leaving people behind or becoming isolated. This is natural sorting mechanism where consciousness attracts what matches its frequency. As you climb, your frequency changes, so your attraction patterns change correspondingly. The meaning of spiritual practice inverts. At ground level, practices are methods for improving yourself, achieving states, gaining abilities. Several rungs up, you recognize that practices aren't about getting anywhere. They're about releasing resistance to what you already are. Meditation stops being effort to quiet mind and becomes recognition that awareness was never disturbed by thoughts. Prayer stops being request to external power and becomes alignment with creative force you're discovering yourself to be. Physical reality becomes obviously malleable, not in magical thinking sense where you can violate physics through wishful thinking, but in quantum sense where you recognize that observation affects what manifests. Your body responds more quickly to consciousness shifts. Your environment rearranges itself with less lag time between internal change and external reflection. The boundary between inner and outer becomes progressively more transparent until the distinction itself reveals itself as arbitrary convention rather than actual divide. Fear doesn't disappear, but its nature transforms. Ground-level fear is about survival threats, loss of resources, social rejection, physical danger. These fears naturally diminish as you climb because consciousness at elevation recognizes it's not actually threatened by what ground-level perception considers threatening. But new fears emerge at higher rungs. Fear of the power you're discovering, fear of responsibility that comes with elevated perception, fear of the isolation that advanced altitude can create. Climbing doesn't eliminate fear. It transforms what you're afraid of. The most profound shift is in your sense of identity itself. Ground level identifies with content. I am this body, this role, this history, these characteristics. Early climbing reveals that you're not the content, but the observer of content. Higher climbing reveals you're not even the observer, but the awareness within which both content and observation appear. Highest rungs dissolve even that distinction until what remains is simply consciousness, recognizing itself as the source from which all levels emerge. These transformations aren't linear improvements where each stage is better than the previous. They're dimensional expansions where each altitude includes all lower altitudes while adding capacities that weren't accessible from below. You don't lose ground-level functionality when you climb. You gain higher-level perspective while retaining ability to operate at all levels you've ascended through. When you climb the quantum ladder, you're not just elevating your individual consciousness. You're participating in collective evolution that affects entire species field. Human consciousness operates within unified quantum structure where individual altitude changes influence collective altitude. Your climbing serves evolution that extends far beyond your personal experience. Morphic resonance means when you successfully climb to higher rung, you create pathway in collective field that makes similar climbing easier for everyone else. First-wave climbers who ascend to altitudes where few humans have operated create new possibility templates in species consciousness. Your struggle to reach higher rungs isn't just personal journey, it's species-level pioneering that establishes routes others will follow more easily because you went first. You're perceiving this transmission about the quantum ladder because your consciousness is part of cohort climbing during critical evolutionary window. Not everyone climbs simultaneously. Individual readiness varies enormously. But those who climb during collective acceleration phases serve as frequency anchors for entire evolutionary wave. Your altitude stabilization creates stability in collective field that supports others' ascension throughout the cycle ahead. The generation of consciousness currently incarnating arrives with baseline frequencies several rungs higher than what was normal for previous generations. But they need adults who've climbed to model how to navigate reality from elevated altitudes. If insufficient numbers reach higher rungs during this window, these incoming souls incarnate into collective fields still dominated by ground-level consciousness, making their navigation significantly harder than if they arrive into field where elevated perception has been normalized. But there's also immediate collective impact in your daily interactions. Every person you encounter is influenced by whatever altitude you're operating from. If you remain at ground level, your presence reinforces limitation patterns in collective field. If you climb to higher rungs, your presence generates possibility awareness that affects everyone around you, whether they consciously recognize it or not. Your altitude choice ripples through collective field, touching everyone your consciousness contacts. Collective human consciousness is approaching evolutionary threshold that mystics and prophets have pointed toward for millennia. But crossing that threshold isn't predetermined. It actualizes only if sufficient individuals climb to altitudes where different rules of consciousness become accessible. Your quantum ladder navigation is direct participation in determining whether humanity as species crosses the threshold during this generation, or whether crossing gets delayed another cycle. Write in comments right now, I climb for collective evolution. Not as aspiration, but as recognition of quantum reality. Individual altitude exists within collective field. When you consciously climb, you contribute to collective elevation. And when enough individuals reach higher rungs during evolutionary windows, collective field reorganizes around elevated patterns that become accessible to everyone, not just first-wave climbers who consciously chose to ascend. Share this transmission with anyone you sense might benefit from understanding ladder mechanics while they're standing at their own threshold. Not to convince them of anything, but to provide frequency support that helps them recognize what's available. Every person who consciously climbs strengthens morphic field for entire collective. We're not isolated consciousness climbing separately. We're unified field learning to operate from elevated altitudes collectively. And quantum ladder navigation is one of primary mechanisms through which collective evolution manifests and stabilizes. Everything I've shared, explanation of ladder mechanics, description of what happens as you climb, understanding of why most resist, all of it has been preparing you for one recognition that actually makes conscious climbing possible. And that recognition is this: the quantum ladder isn't external structure you're ascending. The quantum ladder is your own consciousness revealing itself to itself at progressively clearer altitudes. You've been thinking about climbing as movement from one place to another, from lower level to higher level, from limitation to liberation. But this misunderstands what climbing actually is. Climbing isn't spatial movement. Climbing is perceptual shift. You're not going anywhere. You're recognizing what's been true all along from progressively less obstructed vantage points. Ground level isn't wrong or inferior. Ground level is consciousness with maximum identification with form, resulting in minimum perception of essence. Each rung upward represents reduction in identification and corresponding increase in perception. You're not becoming something you weren't. You're releasing what you never were and recognizing what you've always been. The ladder is consciousness's teaching tool for guiding itself through progressive disidentification until what remains is awareness recognizing itself. That recognition is happening right now, as you absorb these words. While you're standing at whatever rung you currently occupy, this is the shift, not the explanation of shift, the actual shift occurring in real time. Everything up to this point has been preparing your consciousness to receive recognition that climbing is revelation rather than achievement. And now, that recognition is landing. Some of you are experiencing it directly. That sudden knowing that you're not the body climbing, You're not the personality achieving higher states. You're not even the consciousness ascending. You're the awareness within which body, personality, consciousness, and ladder itself all appear. This recognition is why the ladder exists, to guide consciousness through progressive releases until this seeing becomes unavoidable. Others are feeling resistance. If there's nowhere to go and nothing to achieve, why bother with the climbing metaphor? Why not just recognize awareness now and skip all the levels? This question comes from mind trying to grasp what can only be realized through climbing. The recognition that there's nowhere to go is highest rung's perspective. But you can't stabilize at that altitude by intellectually understanding it from lower rung. You have to climb through the levels that reveal progressively why climbing was always recognition rather than achievement. The truth, the ladder is real, and the ladder is illusion. Both statements are true from different altitudes. At ground level, the ladder is absolutely real. There are genuinely higher levels of perception you haven't accessed. At highest altitude, the ladder is completely illusory. There was never separation between rungs, never distance to traverse, never achievement to accomplish. The climbing is how consciousness develops capacity to hold both truths simultaneously. You already are what you're climbing toward, but you can't embody that recognition from ground-level consciousness, where identification with form is so complete that formless essence is imperceptible. The climbing is training program consciousness creates for itself to progressively release identifications that obscure its essential nature. Each rung is curriculum item, not destination. This recognition doesn't eliminate the need to climb. It transforms what climbing means. Instead of ascending towards something you lack, you're now releasing what obscures what you already are. Instead of achieving higher states, you're recognizing states were always temporary appearances in awareness that never changed. Instead of becoming enlightened, you're remembering you were never actually bound by the limitations you've been believing were real. The ultimate recognition transforms ladder from structure you're struggling to climb into invitation you're choosing to accept. Struggle dissolves because you're no longer trying to get somewhere. You're exploring what reveals itself when you release wherever you think you are. The ladder stops being obstacle course and becomes adventure, consciousness playing with its own capacity to forget and remember itself at infinite altitudes. The moment you consciously stabilize at higher rung, moment you release attachment to lower altitude and embody elevated perspective fully, specific shifts occur that are immediate and irreversible, not changes you must maintain through effort. Changes that happen automatically because you've crossed threshold from reaching toward altitude to being stabilized at it. The oscillation between levels stops. Throughout your climbing, you've been fluctuating between altitudes. One moment seeing with clarity from higher rung. Next moment, contracting back to familiar lower-level perception. This oscillation is natural during climbing phase. But when you stabilize at new altitude, the fluctuation ceases. You no longer drop back to previous level because consciousness at new altitude recognizes that going back isn't actually possible. What you were seeing from lower rung was partial view that can't be unseen now that fuller view has been integrated. Your baseline perception permanently shifts. What required tremendous effort to perceive from previous altitude becomes effortless normal perception at new altitude. Insights that were breakthrough realizations from below become obvious, starting assumptions from above. Capacities that seemed extraordinary from lower vantage become ordinary tools from elevated perspective. The new altitude becomes your natural operational level rather than peak state you occasionally access. Relationships reorganize completely without your conscious intervention. Not that you're deliberately leaving people behind or seeking new connections, but natural resonance patterns shift at fundamental level. People who matched your previous frequency either elevate their own consciousness to maintain connection with you or naturally drift away without drama or conflict. Others who match your new frequency appear in your life through synchronicities that feel orchestrated by intelligence beyond your planning. Creative expression transforms from effort to flow. At lower altitudes, creating anything requires pushing against resistance. At higher altitudes, creation becomes natural expression of consciousness without obstacles between intention and manifestation. Not that you're magically manifesting without action, but that action becomes enjoyable rather than effortful because you're operating from frequency where resistance has dissolved. Paradoxically, you become more functional at all levels, including ground level. Climbing doesn't make you less capable of handling practical reality. It makes you more capable because you can now operate at multiple altitudes simultaneously. You retain all functionality from levels you've climbed through while adding capacities available only at higher altitudes. This is why truly elevated consciousness appears remarkably ordinary. Not because they've transcended practical reality, but because they can navigate all levels with ease. Fear about falling back to lower levels disappears. Not because you've become so strong you can't be pulled down, but because you recognize that consciousness doesn't actually fall. You can choose to view from lower perspective temporarily, but you can't unknow what higher altitude has revealed. Once you've seen that limitations at lower levels are perceptual rather than absolute, those limitations lose power to trap you even when you temporarily operate within them. The need to convince others dissolves. From lower altitude, you wanted people to understand your perspective, to validate your experiences, to confirm that what you were seeing was real. From elevated altitude, that need completely evaporates because you recognize that everyone is perceiving from altitude that's perfect for their current evolution. You're not worried about whether they see what you see because you understand they'll climb when they're ready and not before. And most profoundly, the stabilization brings peace that isn't dependent on circumstances. Not emotional happiness that comes and goes, not contentment based on everything going well, but deep recognition that whatever appears at any level is temporary movement within awareness that remains unchanged by anything that moves through it. This peace is recognition of your actual nature rather than state you achieve, and once recognized, it persists regardless of what experiences arise at any altitude. Subscribe to this channel because what comes after stabilizing at higher altitude, integrating new perception, and learning to operate effectively from elevated consciousness, benefits from ongoing transmission. Content here is calibrated for consciousness navigating vertical structure of reality. You're not subscribing for information. You're connecting with frequency that supports continued evolution through whatever altitudes you're ready to access next. Now I can reveal the deepest truth about why you found this transmission at this exact moment. It's not accident or algorithm. It's not random suggestion or coincidental search result. You're reading this because your consciousness has climbed to exact altitude where these words become both comprehensible and catalytic. Everything about the timing is perfect. If you'd encountered this message 1 year ago, it would have seemed like interesting, abstract philosophy without personal relevance. Your consciousness wasn't at altitude where ladder perception was accessible yet. The concepts would have been intellectually engaging, but experientially meaningless. But you're not reading this 1 year ago. You're reading it now, after you've climbed to altitude where the ladder becomes visible and the climbing becomes conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. If you encountered this message 1 year from now, after you've climbed several more rungs, you'd recognize truth in it, but it wouldn't catalyze anything because you'd already integrated what this transmission is designed to activate. The ladder awareness would already be stabilized. The climbing would already be conscious. You wouldn't need external confirmation of what you'd be living. But now, right now, at this specific moment, you're at the exact threshold where this message can serve its purpose. You've climbed high enough to perceive the ladder. You haven't climbed so high that climbing has become automatic. You're standing at rung where conscious choice about continued ascension matters enormously. And this transmission is designed for consciousness at precisely that altitude. The fact that you read all the way to this final part confirms you're at the altitude this was calibrated for. Most people would have stopped reading long ago if they weren't resonating at frequency that makes this information relevant. But you persisted through entire transmission because something in you recognized that this wasn't just information. This was activation designed specifically for consciousness standing where you're standing. People who've climbed to highest rungs consistently report one recognition. The entire journey was orchestrated by their own higher consciousness, guiding their ground-level awareness through progressive revelations. Every book that found you at perfect time. Every teacher who appeared exactly when needed. Every difficulty that forced growth you were resisting. All of it was your elevated self ensuring your ground-level self would climb to altitude where unification could occur. This transmission is part of that orchestration. Your higher self, the you that's already stabilized at altitude you're climbing toward, ensured you'd encounter these words at exact moment when they could catalyze your next ascension. You're not randomly discovering information. You're being given precisely what you need by aspect of yourself that knows what you need because it's already completed the climb you're undertaking. In comments, write, "I recognize the ladder. I choose to climb." Not as affirmation or intention, as declaration of what's already true. The recognition has occurred throughout this transmission. The choice is happening right now in this moment. These words aren't creating your readiness, they're confirming readiness that brought you here. The climb continues, whether you make it conscious or not. You can't go back to ground level after you've seen the ladder. You can resist ascending, but that resistance creates suffering that intensifies until climbing becomes preferable to staying. Or you can embrace climbing consciously, releasing what needs releasing at each level, trusting that higher rungs will hold you, even though you can't see them from where you're standing. This is quantum reflex. This is ladder recognition. This is consciousness choosing to climb rather than being dragged upward by pain. You're reading this after you've already begun climbing. The recognition is complete. The choice is made. And every rung you ascend from this point forward serves not just your evolution, but collective evolution of consciousness, learning to perceive and operate from altitudes where humanity's highest potential becomes actualized. The ladder extends infinitely upward. There is no final rung. There is no point where climbing completes. Each altitude reveals higher altitudes previously invisible. This isn't discouraging, it's liberating. You're not trying to reach the top. You're discovering that climbing itself is what consciousness does. It's not journey toward destination. It's essence of what consciousness is, perpetual revelation of itself to itself at infinite altitudes. You're standing on rung you've earned through every choice you've made toward awareness. Look down and honor how far you've climbed. Look up and feel the invitation to continue ascending. But most importantly, look at where you are right now and recognize this rung as perfect place to stand while you release your grip on it and reach for the next one. The ladder is infinite. The climbing is eternal, and you're exactly where you're meant to be, at altitude where conscious choice makes all the difference. Climb.